I'm Lori Flores, a professor of history at Stony Brook University. So I received my bachelor's degree at Yale University in 2005 and then went on to graduate school at Stanford University and got my PhD in 2011. What prompted me to write this book was this deep awareness of how little Latinos are represented in traditional American history textbooks and the narratives about our nation. Latinos and their voices and their stories are often left out of the bigger narrative of American history. And the important things about our community's experiences have been kind of neglected when it comes to teaching our kids what came before them. So in college, I took a Latino history class, the history of Mexican Americans in the US since 1848, and just fell in love with the subject of Mexican American history. And just the fact that I could teach and write and read for a living, that made me feel like that's really what I wanted to do. And that's everything I've been passionate about ever since. I have never wanted another career besides teaching. And I think part of that comes from my father. It comes from the family that I was raised in, where education was always the most important thing, the priority in our lives. And to know that I can do that for other students, to inspire them and to get them interested in the history of their background and the history of Latinos in the US, the same way that that college professor in that college class did for me. That's why I do what I do, and that's why I wrote this book, so that the work and the research that I do can be out in the public so people can learn about this too. All these labels of Hispanic, Latino, Mexican American, Mexican, these have been words that we've been debating for a really long time, actually. So you're right, in some circles and in some sort of xenophobic ways, the term Mexican has now been this kind of derogatory label, or this way of homogenizing people or conflating people with illegality or with being undocumented or not belonging. And I think that that is something that we as Mexican Americans have to correct in our own community, and also try to inform and educate others outside of our community. So I personally think the way that I identify myself, it changes depending on the context. So in some contexts, I'm Latina. In other contexts, I'm Mexican American. In other contexts, I'm a Tejana. Sometimes we identify by our region and our geographic background. And Hispanic as a term became really popular in the 1980s, especially on the US Census, and with the Reagan era. It was the decade of the Hispanic in the 80s, and everybody kind of got behind that term. But Latino now encompasses Brazilians, for instance, who speak Portuguese, not Spanish, but who are encapsulated within that larger Latin American community. So Latino is the more modern term right now for the day that a lot of people are choosing to use. But depending on where we look, if we look at California, people might be calling themselves Mexican American or Chicano. If we look at Texas, people may be calling themselves Tejano or Hispanic. It's all different depending on the context. So I think that the most important thing, no matter how you choose to identify, is that you are informed about the fact that, Mexican culture and a Mexican background are things to be proud of, not to be denigrated, and in part, it's our responsibility to make that known to people who may otherwise be ignorant of that fact. I come from, a family where going back to school was something both my parents did. They both dropped out of school at the 8th grade level to help their families out on their family farms, but both ended up going back to high school. My father went back for his GED certification and then went on to college in his 30s, so he went back to school at an older age. And my mother went back to high school and started a college education before having me, so she did the same thing. So it's definitely possible. And actually, when I teach college, some of my best students are the older students who have come back to school. They're so motivated, they work harder, they have the motivation and the passion to be there. So some of that is actually really refreshing. If you want to go back to school, it is never too late. We as college professors like to see diverse people in the classroom, and that goes for age too. And in terms of what I would say to young people under 40 who are perhaps struggling with people telling them that they shouldn't dream so big, It's really a matter of, cultivating that strength within yourself to believe that your path is something that you can forge with the support of good people around you, and try to drown out those negative voices. When I was in high school, I was told by my guidance counselor that my two choices were to go to community college or enlist in the military. And she didn't think that because I was a woman, I was working class, and I was Mexican American, that I could get to the Ivy League, that I could apply and get into Yale. And so I did it without her backing or support. And I felt like I'm not going to let somebody who may not even be informed themselves tell me what to do with my life. So it is harder to be more individualistic. It's harder to kind of go against the grain and to go against the current of what people may expect you to do. But it might end up being the most rewarding path for you in the end if what you did came out of an inner strength and this ability to kind of surround yourself with positive people rather than those negative discouragements. Well, I certainly agree that even today, with how progressive some places and people might be, that it is still really hard for a woman, a young woman, but especially a young woman of color like a Latina, to continue to pursue higher education. To get a doctoral degree is something that not only requires so much time, but it also requires you to be very isolated while you're doing your work, doing your research, your data analysis, your writing. These are all really solitary things. So if one knows going into it that that is what you're sacrificing, a lot of time, a lot of energy, and a lot of company of others, right? This is sometimes a very individual pursuit. Then you can be more prepared to handle the challenges that come with really trying to get to a place that not a lot of Latinas are at. I think in terms of history PhDs, I'm something like the 60th Latina in the nation to get one. So it's still a really small number of Latina women who are able to kind of say, I'm a PhD, I joined this echelon of other women of color who have gotten that higher education degree. And what it really requires is for the men in our lives and the other women in our lives to support that. If we don't have the support of our community, it really makes it harder for us to continue to blaze that trail that I think we need to keep traveling. The contributions that I hope my book will make, both on a local level here in my home of South Texas, but also on a national level in the US, is that, I have heard multiple stories from people, Tejanos, people here from Texas who did that migrant labor circuit, who did farm work in places like Michigan, Idaho, California, when they were young during the summers, going with their families in these caravans, to pick strawberries or cherries or cucumbers or these other crops. And so people can connect on a very personal level to that history of farm work and farm labor. But also nationwide, I think it's really important, again, for people to realize how much Latinos have really built this nation, built up the wealth of this nation through their manual labor. And they have been such an integral part of the farm worker story that I hope this book will educate people more on how Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants were treated and how they interacted with each other in the fields. Sadly, our father never got to see me start this book project. What he did get to see was my college thesis. This thesis I had written about Mexican American women garment workers in San Antonio. And, he was a man sometimes of a lot of words and sometimes of a few words, but I remember his words to me after reading that thesis, which was, I'm really proud of you that you're writing these stories and that you're writing this history. And I think before I went to Stanford, around the time that he passed away, I had this internal drive to dedicate this book to him. And I even told him in the last days of his life, I'm going to write a book and I'm dedicating it to you. So it was a promise that I had made to him, and I wanted to keep it. And I think it was that promise that got me through those challenging years of grad school. It was that promise that got me through the writing at 2, 3 in the morning to finish these chapters for this book. And in many ways, It is the story of himself, our family, our community's background, and it's a very personal pursuit of mine, this research project. It's not simply academic work, it's very personal too. I heard stories from our dad about his experiences with discrimination in South Texas, and those stories were stories I saw reflected when I studied Mexican American history in college. So the personal stories he was telling me about being discriminated against in restaurants that would have signs outside saying no Mexicans allowed in this establishment, or the relationship that his father and his family had in terms of their tenant farming arrangement with, people in South Texas, and how he might have encountered discrimination on the part of Anglo-American farmers in his community. That stuck with me, and those were stories that I kept on seeing repeated in the experiences of other people. So his story was representative of much larger narratives that I felt were important to talk about. So the stories we would hear at the kitchen table are now bigger stories that appear in this book. And so I owe a lot to him making me aware of those social issues. So I'm so glad you asked me this, because in the acknowledgments of my book, I have so many family members and I wasn't able to list them all by name. But I really want to thank my mother, Marianne Flores, my father, obviously, Alfredo Flores, to whom this book is dedicated, my sister, Gina Marie Flores, my stepfather, Richard Rocha, and his family, the Rocha family in Corpus Christi, and my stepsister, Paige Rocha, who unfortunately, is away for the holidays, but I miss her a lot all the time, and I really want to thank her for her support of my book, and her constantly asking me, when's your book coming out? It always kept me motivated. I want to thank you, of course, my brother, Joe, and my brothers, Fred, the other Joe, and Tony, and all my aunts, really, Dahlia, Diana, Belinda, Angie, Yolanda. All of these aunts have really, on my mother's side, supported me tremendously and just given me all the love and all the attention that I need when I come home and I need to rest and, to get away from it all. And I really want to thank all of my former teachers. Joseph Eberhardt was the first teacher who really got me into history as a subject, who got me disciplined as a student, and who encouraged me to apply to Yale. If he had never done that, I don't think I would be on the path that I am today. So to all the former teachers that I had here in Alice, and to all the family and friends who did not stop believing that I could continue to be ambitious and didn't make me feel bad for being ambitious, for being an ambitious woman, I thank everybody for that.